You went to bed last night feeling completely normal. No chest pain, no dizziness, no warning bell going off anywhere in your body. And yet, within minutes of opening your eyes this morning, your stroke risk may have already spiked. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of a missed pill or a skipped checkup, but because of one ordinary thing almost every senior does in the first 5 minutes after waking up.
I need you to actually hear this, because it has nothing to do with diet, nothing to do with exercise, and your cardiologist has probably never once mentioned it during a routine appointment. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Stroke risk peaks in the morning hours after waking, with research showing close to a 49% increase between 6 a.m. and noon, driven by a sudden surge in blood pressure.
The moment your body shifts from sleep into motion, that surge is normal. It happens to everyone. But there is a common morning habit that takes that already vulnerable window and makes it measurably worse, and almost nobody connects the two. It is not your coffee. It is not your alarm clock. It is something so automatic, so woven into the first few minutes of the day, that most people don't even register it as a choice.
They just do it every single morning, without ever knowing what it's quietly doing to the arteries feeding their brain. So before you dismiss this and think, I've done this my whole life, I'm fine, stay with me, because what comes next could change how you start every single day from here on. I'm Dr. Isaiah, and this channel exists for one reason: helping adults over 60 understand what the research actually says about their health.
In plain language, without the 12-minute office visit rush that never leaves time for the real explanation. What I'm about to walk you through isn't from a single textbook. It comes from years spent in the cardiovascular and neurological literature, looking specifically at what happens to aging blood vessels in the hours right after waking, the exact window where stroke risk is highest and most overlooked. Before we get into the mechanism, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below and tell me what time you typically wake up. I read every single comment, and your answer is actually going to matter for what I show you next. And if you find this kind of plain language breakdown useful, hit subscribe now, because I cover topics like this every week, the things that affect your heart and brain but rarely come up in a routine appointment. Let me give you the picture before the explanation. Because once you see it, you won't forget it. Picture your blood pressure overnight like a calm lake. While you sleep, a healthy body lets that lake drop, roughly 10 to 20% lower than your daytime levels. Doctors call this nocturnal dipping, and it's protective. It gives your arteries a nightly rest, a chance to recover from the wear of the day before. Now picture what happens the moment you wake up. The lake doesn't just settle back to normal. It surges, fast, like someone opened a floodgate upstream. Your nervous system flips from rest mode into go mode almost instantly. Cortisol rises, adrenaline rises, your heart rate climbs, and your blood pressure can jump significantly within minutes, sometimes before your feet even touch the floor. This is called the morning blood pressure surge, and it is completely normal.
Every person alive experiences some version of it. In a younger body, with elastic, flexible arteries, that surge is absorbed easily, the way a young garden hose flexes under sudden water pressure without strain. But after 60, the picture changes. Arterial walls stiffen with age. The vessels feeding your brain lose some of their ability to expand and contract smoothly. So that same morning surge that a 30-year-old barely notices hits a 68-year-old's arteries like water forced through a rigid pipe. The pressure has nowhere to flex into. It just pushes. This is exactly why stroke incidence is not evenly spread across the day. It clusters in the morning. And the reason is this surge meeting vessels that can no longer absorb it gracefully. Here's the part that matters most for what we're about to cover. The size and speed of that surge isn't fixed. It isn't purely automatic. It can be made sharper or gentler, depending on what your body does in the first few minutes after waking, before you've even had coffee, before you've left the bedroom. Most people assume the surge just happens to them, a switch flipped by nature that they have no control over. That assumption is where the real problem hides, because one specific, extremely common morning action can take an already steep surge and make it steeper still,
adding unnecessary strain to vessels that are already working at their limit the moment you open your eyes. That is the habit we need to talk about next. Here's what almost every senior believes about waking up, and I hear some version of it from patients constantly. I jump out of bed the second my eyes open. Gets the blood flowing, gets me energized for the day. It sounds logical. It feels productive. Lying there for even a minute can feel lazy, like wasted time you should be spending getting moving. So the moment the alarm goes off, or the moment your eyes simply open on their own, up you go, feet on the floor, straight to the bathroom, straight to the kitchen, straight into the day. Let me be direct with you. That belief is dangerous, and for anyone over 60, it deserves to be retired completely. Your body is not a light switch. It does not go from fully asleep to fully awake the instant your eyes open. There is a transition your cardiovascular system needs to make, a shift from the slow, low-pressure rhythm of sleep into the higher demand rhythm of being upright and active. That transition takes time. It is not optional, and it cannot be skipped.
Just because you feel ready to move? When you sit up abruptly and stand within seconds of waking, you are stacking two separate cardiovascular events directly on top of each other. The first is the natural morning blood pressure surge we just discussed, already underway as soon as your nervous system senses you're awake. The second is something called orthostatic stress, the sudden demand placed on your heart and vessels when you shift from lying flat to standing upright. Gravity instantly pulls blood downward toward your legs, and your cardiovascular system has to react immediately to keep enough blood reaching your brain. In a younger body, these two events barely register as a combined load. But layer orthostatic stress on top of an already steep morning surge in vessels that have lost a measure of their elasticity with age, and you get a compounded spike. Sharper and faster than either event would produce alone. This is not a theoretical concern. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the cardiovascular literature on older adults. Rapid position changes immediately after waking are associated with measurable spikes in blood pressure and a higher likelihood of transient drops in cerebral blood flow in the same window. So, if you've spent years believing that jumping straight out of bed is a sign of vitality, I want you to set that belief aside for the next few minutes. What feels like energy may actually be your arteries absorbing a hit they were never designed to take all at once. Now that you understand the surge and the myth around jumping out of bed, I want to give you a simple framework, because not every morning habit carries the same risk. Over the years, I found it helpful to sort the things people do in those first few minutes after waking into three categories. Once you know which category a habit falls into, you'll immediately understand whether it's protecting you or quietly working against you. Category 1 is what I call a buffer habit. These are actions that slow the transition from sleep to upright movement, giving your cardiovascular system the time it needs to adjust gradually. Lying still for a moment, breathing slowly, easing into a seated position before standing. These habits work with your body's natural rhythm instead of against it. Category 2 is a neutral habit. These don't meaningfully help or harm the surge one way or the other. Checking the time, glancing at the window for daylight, these are essentially cardiovascularly invisible. Category 3 is what I call an accelerant habit. These are actions that compress the transition, forcing your body to handle the surge, and moving all at once, with no buffer in between. This is the category that matters most for what we're discussing today, because it's also the category most seniors fall into without realizing it, simply because the habit feels efficient, or has become so automatic they never stop to examine it. Here's why this framework matters. Most health advice treats things you do in the morning as one big undifferentiated bucket, good or bad based on vague impressions. But your arteries don't experience it that way. They experience a sequence: sleep, surge, transition, movement. And each habit you layer into that sequence either smooths the curve or sharpens it. The habit I'm about to walk you through falls squarely into category 3, an accelerant. It is one of the most common things people do within the first 60 seconds of waking. And it takes a surge your body is already managing and compresses it into an even narrower, steeper spike, right when your arteries have the least capacity to absorb it. Keep this 3-category framework in mind as we go, because by the end of this video,
I want you walking away not just knowing this one habit, but able to look at your own morning routine and sort it for yourself: buffer, neutral, or accelerant. Here's the habit. It's reaching for your phone the second you open your eyes. Not lying there scrolling for 20 minutes. That's a separate problem. I'm talking about the first 60 seconds. Eyes open, hand reaches over, thumb unlocks the screen, and before your feet have even left the mattress, your brain is processing light, notifications, headlines, maybe a text from your daughter, maybe a stressful email.
Here's why this specific habit lands in the accelerant category, and why it's worse than almost anything else people do in that window. Your nervous system wakes up in stages. The first stage is largely automatic, hormonal, your cortisol and adrenaline beginning their natural climb regardless of what you do. But the second stage, full cognitive alertness, is triggered by sensory input, specifically bright light and mental stimulation. A phone screen delivers both instantly and intensely. The brightness signals your brain that it's fully daytime, accelerating the hormonal surge that was already underway. And the content, words, numbers, demands, decisions, pulls your nervous system straight into an alert reactive state before your cardiovascular system has had even 30 seconds to adjust to being conscious.
Research on light exposure and the autonomic nervous system has shown that bright screen exposure immediately upon waking measurably sharpens the speed of the cortisol response compared to a slower, dim light transition. A faster cortisol curve means a faster, steeper blood pressure curve riding right behind it. Now stack on the emotional component. A notification about a bill, a worrying headline, a stressful message. These all add a stress response on top of the wake-up surge, the equivalent of stepping on the gas pedal while the engine is already accelerating from a cold start. For a 35-year-old, this compounded jolt is uncomfortable at worst. For someone over 60 with arteries that have already lost a measure of their elasticity, you're now asking vessels with the least capacity to absorb a spike to absorb the steepest one of the entire day.
All within the first minute of being conscious. This is happening to most of you reading this right now, every single morning, without a second thought. Not because you're doing something reckless, because nobody ever explained that this specific minute is the most cardiovascularly vulnerable minute of your entire day. Here's where this gets serious, because the consequences of this habit don't stay isolated to a single rough morning. They compound. Stroke risk in the morning hours isn't a minor statistical blip. It's one of the most consistently replicated findings in cardiovascular research, with that nearly 49% increase in stroke incidence between 6 a.m. and noon showing up across multiple population studies over the years. That's not a number describing an unlucky few. That's describing what happens, on average, when the morning surge meets a body unprepared to absorb it.
Now layer in what we know about repeated stress on arterial walls. Every time blood pressure spikes sharply and quickly, rather than rising gradually, it places mechanical strain on the lining of your blood vessels, the endothelium. A single sharp spike on a single morning is something a healthy vascular system tolerates without lasting damage. But this isn't a single morning. For most people, reaching for the phone immediately upon waking is a daily ritual, repeated 365 mornings a year, year after year. Research on hemodynamic stress patterns has shown that repeated, sharp blood pressure spikes, distinct from the same average pressure delivered gradually, are associated with accelerated arterial stiffening over time. In other words, the steep, compressed nature of this particular surge may be doing more cumulative damage than the surge's existence alone would explain.
And there's a second layer most people never consider: the emotional content itself. A 2021 review on acute psychological stress and cardiovascular reactivity found that exposure to stress-inducing content, financial concerns, distressing news, conflict-laden messages, produces measurable spikes in both heart rate and blood pressure within minutes, independent of any physical exertion. Combine that emotional spike with the physiological surge already underway from waking, and you have two separate stress pathways converging on the same narrow window, in the same vulnerable vessels, at the same time. This is why I want you to stop thinking of this as simply a phone habit. It's a daily, repeated cardiovascular event, stacked on top of your body's single most vulnerable hour, happening before you've had a sip of water, before your feet have touched the floor. The good news And this is genuinely good news, is that this entire chain of events is interruptible. Not with medication, not with a procedure, with a 60-second change to how your morning begins. Let me tell you about a patient I'll call Harold, 69 years old, retired electrician, the kind of man who prided himself on discipline, up at 5:45 every morning without fail, decades of habit baked into his routine. His routine looked like this. Alarm goes off, hand reaches for the phone on the nightstand before his eyes are even fully open. Check the time, check the weather, check the news, check his email, all before he'd sat up in bed. He told me once, half joking, that he liked to hit the ground running.
He saw it as discipline, as efficiency, the same quality that had made him good at his job for 40 years. He'd been managing borderline high blood pressure for years. Nothing dramatic, nothing his primary care doctor seemed overly concerned about. Just a number to keep an eye on. He felt fine. No symptoms, no warning signs his daughter or his doctor would have caught on a routine visit. One morning, reaching for his phone the way he had 10,000 mornings before, Harold noticed his left hand felt strange. Not numb exactly, just slow, clumsy, like it wasn't quite responding the way it should. It passed within a couple of minutes. He chalked it up to sleeping on it wrong and went about his day. When he mentioned it to me, almost in passing at a follow-up weeks later, that brief, transient weakness was enough for me to take it seriously. We ran further evaluation, and while Harold never went on to have a major stroke, what we found was a pattern: consistently elevated morning blood pressure readings, sharp and disproportionate compared to his readings later in the day. When we walked through his morning routine together, the phone-reaching habit was the first thing that stood out. We made one change. Harold started leaving his phone across the room, charging, out of reach from the bed. He committed to 2 minutes of simply lying still and breathing before sitting up. Nothing else changed. No new medication, no major lifestyle overhaul. At his next visit, his morning blood pressure readings had measurably smoothed out, no longer the sharp spike his earlier logs had shown. He told me, almost sheepishly, that he felt calmer in those first few minutes than he had in years, and that the irony wasn't lost on him. The habit he'd always seen as discipline had actually been working against the very body he was trying to take care of. Harold's case isn't unique. It's a pattern I see again and again. A habit so automatic, nobody thinks to question it, until something forces the question. Here's exactly what to do, starting tomorrow morning. No products, no supplements, no appointments needed. Just a few simple shifts to how your first 60 seconds unfold. Step 1. Move your phone out of arm's reach tonight. Charge it across the room, on a dresser, on a kitchen counter, anywhere that requires you to physically stand up and walk to reach it. This single change does most of the work on its own because it removes the option entirely during the moment that matters most. Step 2. When you wake up, before you do anything else, stay lying down for 60 to 90 seconds. Keep your eyes open if you'd like, but don't reach for anything, don't check anything. Just breathe slowly and let your body register that it's awake without flooding it with light and information at the same time. This gives your nervous system the buffer it needs before the next demand hits. Step 3. Sit up slowly. Pause at the edge of the bed for a moment with your feet flat on the floor, then stand. This staged transition, lying to sitting to standing, spreads the orthostatic demand across a few separate steps instead of asking your cardiovascular system to handle it all in one abrupt motion. Step 4. Once you're up and moving, that's when the phone can come back into your morning, not before. By this point, several minutes have passed, your surge has had time to begin smoothing out naturally, and the same notifications that would have sharpened a wake-up spike now land on a body that's already adjusted. Step 5. If you take morning blood pressure readings, or if your doctor has ever asked you to monitor at home, take that first reading after this routine. You may find, the way Harold did, that the numbers look different than you expected. One more thing worth mentioning. If you already experience morning dizziness, brief weakness, or any of the warning signs we've covered on this channel before when standing up, that's not something to manage with a phone habit change alone. That's a conversation to have directly with your doctor. That's it. 5 steps, none of which cost anything, none of which require giving up your phone.
just changing when it enters your morning. Try it for 7 days. Keep a simple note of how you feel in those first few minutes. Calmer, clearer, less rushed, and decide for yourself whether the difference is real. Here's what I want you to take away from everything we've covered today.
Your stroke risk doesn't wait for a scary symptom to announce itself. In many ways, the first 60 seconds after you wake up are the most cardiovascularly demanding moment of your entire day, and the habit sitting on your nightstand right now may be quietly making that moment harder than it needs to be. You don't need a new prescription. You don't need a procedure. You need one small, free, immediate change, moving your phone out of reach tonight and giving your body 60 seconds before the day begins. Now, drop a comment below and tell me, where do you keep your phone overnight? On the nightstand, under your pillow, across the room? I read every single comment, and I want to know how common this habit really is among everyone watching. If this video gave you something your last checkup never did, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this kind of practical, plain language information reach more people who are starting their mornings the same way Harold did, without ever knowing why it mattered. And please, share this with someone specific. A spouse who reaches for their phone before their feet hit the floor. A parent who prides themselves on hitting the ground running every morning. A sibling managing blood pressure who's never once been told about this window. The person who most needs to hear this probably isn't going to search for it themselves. You might be the reason they find it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I cover topics exactly like this every week. Practical, evidence-based, and honest. The things that affect your heart and your brain, but rarely come up in a rushed appointment. And if you want to understand more about what's happening to your cardiovascular system overnight, the hours before this surge even begins, I have another video covering exactly that. The sleep positions that either protect your brain or quietly work against it while you rest. I'll link it for you to check out next. Your morning routine has been running on autopilot for years, maybe decades. Today's the day you get to look at it differently. Try the 60-second pause tomorrow morning, just once. See how it feels. I'm Dr. Isaiah. Take care of yourselves, protect that first minute of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.